Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the 28th National Space Symposium. Please welcome the Space Foundation's Vice President, Washington Operations, Mr. Brendan Curry.
Well, top of the morning to you, and welcome to the last day of the 28th Annual National Space Symposium. I want to thank the good people at Booz Allen Hamilton for providing us coffee this morning. Thank you very much. The issue of export controls has vexed this industry for over a decade. It's been something that we as an industry have been grappling with and trying to work with various administrations and various Congresses. From my perspective, actually, though, I've never been more optimistic about the chances of reform and modernization, and thus enabling us to retain precious national security technology, but also enable our industry to unleash itself and compete on the global scale. There were some attempts beginning in the waning months of the Bush administration to address this. The Obama administration should be praised for taking this issue up and making it a priority. I'm also, in my opinion, I'm thinking that hearts are not as hardened in Congress anymore. Many of the most hardened opponents of export control have left Congress or are about to leave Congress. Legislation, you're seeing talk of export modernization in hearings, you're seeing it in legislation, and as a prime example was the 2010 Defense Authorization Bill that directed the Departments of Defense and State to address and study the issue of what would be the national security impacts of removing satellites and satellite-related componentry from the USML and what that would mean. I'm very happy and very proud to say that the department decided to use the National Space Symposium as a venue to release the reports and their findings. And we've made some special time this morning for Ambassador Greg Schulte to come up and provide a few remarks to further explain what the administration's findings are and what that means to our industry. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Ambassador Greg Schulte.
Well, good morning. Last year at this symposium, I talked to you about the National Security Space Strategy. This is a strategy which we're still implementing that's about maintaining the strategic advantages we derive from space in an environment that is increasingly congested, contested, and competitive. And I think throughout the symposium this week, you've heard examples of how we're implementing this strategy. You heard from Frank Rose about how we're working with the State Department to develop norms for responsible behavior in space. You heard from General Schulte about how we're designing resilience and commercial opportunities into our architectures. You heard from General Kaler about how we're bringing coalition operations to space. We're doing other things. We're being very careful, in some ways obvious, in some ways less obvious, to signal to those who would interfere with our vital interest in space that that would be a mistake, that the results would be unpredictable and not in their favor. And we're working with the Secretary of the Air Force and the new Defense Space Council to bring coherence to all these efforts. Now, this document has three basic objectives. First, to protect space as an operating domain for our military, but also as a domain increasingly important to our country's economy. Second, to protect the strategic advantages that we derive from space. And third, and this is what I want to talk about now, energizing our industrial base that is so important for us to sustain that advantage. Yesterday, we released to Congress a report that is a key aspect of implementing this strategy. It's a report about how we think, if Congress agrees, we can make export control more smart. And we think that if Congress agrees with us, we can do two things. We think that we can allow our industry to compete globally in those areas where satellites and systems and technology is already readily available. Why do we want to do that? We want industry to compete because, particularly at a time of reduced budgets, we need to help energize our industrial base, and that strengthens our national security. Secondly, with smart export control, we can also focus our controls and our enforcement on those technologies that are truly sensitive to our national security. 2 years ago when I started this job, I went to Europe and I met with the European Space Agency. I met with a senior European space official. And we talked about cooperation in space. And he told me, you know, Ambassador, those ITAR constraints, they're not very good for cooperation, but they're great for competition, ours. Well, we'd like to change that if Congress agrees with us. We'd like to put ourselves in a position where we can facilitate that cooperation that's so important to our strategy and to our national security, but also let our industry go out and compete, because competing in these areas, particularly at a time of constrained budgets, is important to the health of our industrial base, and that's important to the health of our national security. So we look forward to working with Congress on this. We look forward to working with all of you on this, and we hope that we can strengthen our industrial base and therefore strengthen our national security and continue to execute this strategy. Thank you very much.